Hema is, she's also a postgraduate research scholar with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and she's a consultant for the WWF on energy-related issues. She's a PhD from the University of British Columbia and a Master's of Environment from the Australian National University. She's published and presented widely on Asia's role in the Arctic and has worked for the government of Singapore on issues of international biodiversity, conservation, and climate change. And so Hema is a perfect person to moderate this next session on Asia states and the Arctic. And so I will let the three of you begin and have a good conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jessica, for a wonderful introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure both to moderate this panel of highly esteemed guests and to welcome you to the panel on Asian states and the Arctic. So first, allow me to introduce our panelists. We have a very distinguished panel, which in fundamental sense needs no introduction, so I'll be brief. Ambassador Kanji Yamanouchi has been the ambassador of Japan to Canada since May 2022. Prior to this assignment, he was ambassador of Japan in New York. He has been serving Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for over 38 years, during which he has held the positions of Director of First Southeast Asia Division, the Director of the Press Division, Director of the First North America Division, Executive Assistant to the Prime Minister, Deputy Director General of the Asian and Oceanian Affairs Bureau, and the Assistant Minister for the Economic Affairs Bureau. His diplomatic postings include the assignments to the Embassy of Japan in the US as First Secretary and Embassy of Japan in Korea as Counselor. He was posted to the Embassy of Japan in Washington for the second time as Minister of Economic Affairs. Welcome, Ambassador. Ambassador Woongsoon Lim is Ambassador of the Republic of Korea. He arrived in Ottawa on October 2022. His recent assignments include the Deputy Chief of Mission and Political Minister in the Korean Embassy in Washington, Deputy Consul General in New York. Ambassador Lim joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He served as Principal Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Director of European Division, Director of Humanitarian Assistance Division, Deputy Director General for the North Korean Nuclear Affairs Bureau, the Director General for Human Resources. His previous overseas postings include Vienna, Nairobi, Washington, Rome, Paris, and Madrid. Welcome, Ambassador. And thank you both for joining us today. So the topic for this morning is the role of Asian states in the Arctic, which has gained plenty of traction since the 5 Asian states, China, India, Japan, Republic of Korea, and Singapore were admitted into the Arctic Council in 2013 as observers. The role of these states in the Arctic seems even more topical now, with Canada's recently released Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as the multiple reinforcing crises that we are observing. Amid multiple global crises and conflicts, the often cited concept of Arctic exceptionalism, the unique governance that has facilitated cooperation in the region, has come under strain. We are seeing a series of overlapping and multi-layered geopolitical issues presenting challenges to Arctic governance, which is often assumed to be resistant to conflict elsewhere, and to cooperation being the norm of the region. We've heard from our panelists earlier today a lot about Russia. So from escalating tensions between the US and China as well, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to the ever-accelerating climate crisis, the Arctic is at a point of inflection. So with the Arctic Council coming under strain, concerns of the role of observer states have been raised. However, not all activity in the High North has been frozen. Non-Arctic states have remained active. Within the region, observer states have continued to articulate official strategies, pay senior-level official visits to the region, and hopeful observers continue advocating for admission to the Arctic Council. So it is clear that non-Arctic states' interest in the North has not waned. Now, we know the Arctic is not a discrete and isolated entity in international relations. What happens in the Arctic does not remain in the Arctic, as we've often heard, nor is the region unaffected by events elsewhere. We are seeing more scholarship on non-Arctic states that moves beyond a perspective that questions their role in a compartmentalized region to one that examines their engagement in a globalized Arctic influx. So against this backdrop, we have several topics lined up for the panel's consideration today. Time permitting, we will be covering in no particular order: national security, critical minerals, a very popular theme today, international cooperation, conservation, and indigenous engagement. I'll then open up the floor for questions in the last 15 to 20 minutes. And so what I'll do is I'll kick off the conversation, asking questions that draw out some of these high-level themes, and then we'll go to questions. So let's get into it. So against the backdrop of Russia's invasion in Ukraine and the ripple effects that we've observed in the Arctic, from the pause in the Arctic Council to the formation of an Arctic-7, what do you see as the biggest national security concerns for the Arctic and Canada from your perspective? Maybe Ambassador Yamanouchi?
Yes, but first of all, thank you very much, Jessica, and having me here today. And Dr. Hema Nadarajah, thank you very much. And I'm very grateful and honored to be part of this very important event, and it's very timely. I say timely because we have seen this huge change in an international, say, order or international situation or geopolitical conditions. We have seen a lot of the things, like attempts by totalitarian nations to change status quo by unilaterally using force. And we can't accept that. And the international order, based upon rule of law, has to be so cherished and upheld. And in that context, we see so many things in the globe, but Arctic is not the exception. And we have seen so many things happening in Arctic. And so looking back a little bit, and it was 2012 when Japan received the first cargo ship from Europe via Northern Sea route. That was a kind of wake-up call for the Japanese people. Wow, so Arctic Ocean is an opportunity. But at the same time, we have seen so many attempts by certain countries to change status quo by using force. And you just mentioned this sort of connotation of Arctic Sea. And say the military experts are talking about the submarines. And that is a direct threat to the national security to this country. And actually, fortunately or unfortunately, Japan is a bit far away from Arctic Ocean. But we became the observer of AC 2013. Then that is not other people's matter. That is our matter too, because the world is so connected. And so when the Japanese government issued the first edition of our comprehensive policies on Arctic, that was 2015. It mentioned that the connotation of the national security and the businesses, that includes the critical minerals, and also the international cooperation, especially research on a scientific base, and also the conservation of the Mother Nature, and also there are 4 million people living in that area as indigenous people. And the global warming directly affects them. Therefore, we have to support them. So in those 5 areas, First Nation, national security, businesses, environment, and international cooperation, that is the sort of whole picture. And everything is related. So it is very important to talk about the national security in Arctic, but at the same time, we have to bear our minds on other elements. But for Canadian, if I put myself in Canadian shoes, and Arctic was almost a natural fortress up to certain years ago. But now, ice is melting, so there are a lot of opportunities or challenges are taking place. And national security is one of those. It's a very, very serious one, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. No, you're certainly right. They're all multiple reinforcing, and they are certainly overlapping. We can't look at one issue without looking at the rest as well. Ambassador Lim?
Okay, I also thank Arctic360 for inviting me to this conference. Even though I have been in the Korean Foreign Ministry for several decades, I didn't have a chance to talk about the Arctic issue. So when I got the invitation, I was quite hesitant to accept it. But when I found that Ambassador Yamanouchi was the only participant from the Asian ambassadors, I believe it is time to show my solidarity to Japan. And concerning the security implication of the Russia's war on Ukraine, on the Canadian security, well, as you see, we have witnessed the return of geopolitics for the last decade, and even Arctic exceptionalism has fallen victim to it. And the Arctic Council has been suspended, not because of the Arctic issue, but because of the non-Arctic issue. And we know that we cannot just continue our business as usual. And my personal thought on the implication on the Canadian security is when I see Canadian geopolitics, I found that it's exactly the opposite of Korea. Korea is being surrounded by major powers, our Japanese friends, China and Russia and the United States. Well, even though the United States is an ocean away from the East region, East Asia, they have a very strong political, economic, and military presence in the region. So if you just see the number of American troops stationed in Japan and Korea, it's more than 75,000. And Korea welcomed and strongly support the American presence, and also we appreciate the trilateral cooperation among Korea, Japan, and the United States to counter the threat from North Korea. But when I see the Canadian geopolitics, this is a really fortunate country to have Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the United States to the south, and the zone of peace zone of Arctic exceptionalism to the north. And I had a session with some people in the think tank last year, and they start to worry about the growing security dangers like the modernization of Russian military bases in the Arctic and possible covert operation of the submarines, the third country submarines off the northern coast of Canada, maybe the infiltration of the unmanned aerial vehicles into Canadian airspace, like what recently happened. So, well, it's very discouraging and maybe so alarming for Canadians to see where they are now facing a security danger at their doorstep. Of course, even with the total collapse of the Arctic exceptionalism, it's not likely for Canada to come under the foreign attack, but since you have a long coastline on the Arctic, having a new security dangers, and also because of the ice melting in the Arctic, it means we are going to have some new shipping routes. New shipping routes means more business activities. So Canada is becoming more exposed to the external activities on the northern side. And it means where Canada needs to strengthen the reconnaissance and the surveillance activities. So unless Canada increase the defense spending dramatically, that means you need to shift your military asset from other regions to the north. And Canada has been a strong supporter of the international engagement. Canada has participated in the World War I and World War II, and also as a founding member of NATO, Canada is fully committed to the security of Europe. And if you see the Pacific side, as you know, Canada sent the third largest troops during the Korean War. And since then, Canada has dispatched a group of Canadian soldiers to the UN command in Korea. And even these days, Canada operates a frigate and an aerospace, the airplane, military aircraft to monitor the violations, those Korean violations of the UN security resolution. And Canada unveiled the Indo-Pacific strategy last year, and with that Indo-Pacific strategy in place, Canada is supposed to engage with East Asia and Indo-Pacific area more diplomatically and more militarily and economically. So as you have the new dangers from the Arctic, Canada may run the risk of its military asset being spreading out too thin. So this overburdened task for Canada may need more cooperation with the like-minded countries like Korea and Japan. And Korea is ready to have more cooperation, more military and diplomatic cooperation with Canada in the Indo-Pacific area. And one interesting aspect of the Indo-Pacific strategy of Canada and Korea, we are the only countries that have the element of North Pacific cooperation in the Indo-Pacific strategy. And Canada called the Pacific, North Pacific, as one of the approaches to the Canadian Arctic. And by implementing this Indo-Pacific strategy, I believe we can develop new cooperation mechanism involving Canada, Korea, and other like-minded countries like Japan or United States, and it will be open to everybody who is ready to respect the rule-based international order. And when we have that kind of cooperation mechanism, as Canadians said, since North Pacific is the gateway to the Arctic, we can make some meaningful contribution to the maintaining a peace zone in the Arctic.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly the increased focus and a pivot to Asia is increasingly important. We are seeing it, as again you mentioned, this relatively new term of North Pacific strategy within the Indo-Pacific strategy is gaining a lot of traction too. So I'm going, sorry, did you want?
Yeah,
yes.
if I may,
Yes,
so talking
Ambassador.
about the Indo-Pacific strategy, that was issued in November last year. Then 1 month before that, the Foreign Minister Jolie came to Japan and also to South Korea. Then when she came to Japan, she had a meeting, very productive meeting with her counterpart, Foreign Minister of Japan, Hayashi. And two foreign ministers issued what we call action plans, which is contributing to free and open Indo-Pacific, 6 priority areas. One of those clearly mentioned that the cooperation in those Arctic side. And the basic theme is rule of law. And we do have the, United Nations Convention on the Sea, Law of the Sea, and also the agreement on the prohibiting the unregulated fisheries, and also international code of ships. And those international rules have to be observed. And that is the kind of the understanding of both Canada and Japan to make sure that the stability and international order in Arctic side. And talking about the national security, and this just past August, the joint exercise called Nanook was conducted for the security in Arctic area. And 2 officers from the self-defense forces were dispatched to observe that. That is the clear engagement of the Japanese side to address this geopolitical challenges in Arctic area. I just want to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, there are 3 binding agreements within the Arctic Council, but it's also very important to understand that there are a lot of other harder treaties and harder international legal instruments governing the North outside of the Arctic Council, as you just mentioned. Yeah. So a little bit of a pivot here. We're going to go to the topic of critical minerals and renewables. Japan and South Korea are both en route to meeting their net zero targets by 2050, making major investments to do so from nuclear to renewables, and a large focus is on critical mineral economy. Ambassador Yamanouchi, can you talk a bit about your interests and for increased Japanese investments in Canada's critical mineral economy, from mining projects in the Canadian North to manufacturing and processing?
Yes, very much. So most of the country has committed carbon neutral by 2050. That have to, a very important kind of the element. So in order to make sure that we commit to the net zero or carbon neutral by 2050, we have to reduce the emission gas. And 25% of the emission gas are from the transportation, cars. So emission zero vehicle is indispensable. But in order to make emission zero vehicle, we have to have the important sort of, components, the batteries and other things. That inevitably requires all those critical minerals. The thing is, at this moment, all those critical minerals pretty much sort of covered by the Chinese sort of companies, the Chinese government. Then this critical mineral is kind of the intersection between market economy and green economy and geopolitics. So some countries been sort of using those dependence of other countries for their political purposes. Therefore, Canada's role is very, very important. And therefore, the Japanese company are very much interested in entire Canada. And they're talking about the Arctic, and the Japanese company is called Sumitomo, having the contract with Yukon, and they are importing the copper. And that's very, very important elements for the Japanese industry. And many other companies are interested in sort of developing their critical mineral related issues. But I would say 3 challenges. And the one is infrastructure. The other one is regulation. And third one is the cooperation from the First Nations. And so theoretically, we know that there are so many opportunities and possibilities and potentials in this country regarding the critical minerals. But at the same time, I'm talking with the Japanese business people. They are saying that in order to do business, they have to have the certain sort of, what can I say, profitability of it. Therefore, if they have to wait for 10 years to get the approval, well, for if they have been always asking the new conditions on the environmental issues. For if they do not get enough support and understanding, it's kind of a disruption. And so in a sense, yes, we see a great opportunities and great potentials. But at the same time, those 3 major challenges have to be met. So in that sense, we are very much interested in the critical mineral strategy by Canada. That was announced last December. If my memory is correct, Friday the 9th of December. Then next Monday, the 12th of December, Monday, in Montreal, the Minister Wilkinson launched what they call Sustainable Critical Mineral Alliance, and Japan is part of it. So, but we are really looking forward to Canada's role in this part. And the critical mineral is not only the business opportunities in Arctic, but there's also navigation. I just mentioned the cargo ships through the northern sea route. It's an enormous shorten the date. If they use the regular course, like it takes like 40 days, maybe more. But if they use the northern sea route, it's much shorter, less than 2 weeks. So that makes a big, big differences. But at the same time, once again, this navigation is also have to be met with environmental issues, because Mother Nature in that part is very, very indispensable. So we see always a balance between the economic opportunities and business opportunities and conservation of the environment. So that's a very delicate question. But all in all, the Japanese government and Japanese companies are very much interested in the Canada's role in critical minerals, including Arctic area.
Yeah, absolutely. All this conversation about critical minerals and renewables, they're not without its fair share of issues when it comes to environmental impact. Ambassador Lim, late last year, Canada and South Korea agreed to deepen cooperation on critical minerals using electric vehicle batteries, as both countries are seeking to cut emissions as well to fight climate change. Can you share with us what you'd like to see come out of these Korean investments in Canada's critical mineral economy in the north?
Yes. Well, as you said, one of the top agendas for Korea-Canada relationship is to build a new economic partnership on economic security and ensuring secure and reliable supply of critical minerals is a crucial part of that new economic partnership. I want to point out 4 things. The number one, Korean companies have the second largest global market share in semiconductors and electric vehicle batteries after Chinese. In case of semiconductor, Taiwan is number one, and in case of electric vehicle batteries, China is number two. But we are too much reliant on a certain countries. Like in case of the secondary battery, we found that Korean companies have a very, very high ratio of reliance just on China. And that number reaches around 77%. And Korean companies are more dependent on the Chinese suppliers, even than the Chinese companies are. So we need to diversify the supply source of the critical minerals, and even geopolitical consideration aside, the over-reliance on just one supplier is against the time-honored, very economic axiom, like don't put all your eggs in one basket. So we need a diversification of the source of the critical minerals. And we believe Canada is a perfect partner for the partnership for several reasons. The first one is Canada is the only country in the Western Hemisphere that has all critical minerals required to manufacture the electric vehicle batteries. And number two, Canada and Korea, we are like-minded countries to share the core values. And number three, in year 2015, we signed the free trade agreement, and it was the first free trade agreement Canada had signed with Asian countries. And lastly, we have a very strong Korean community in Canada. Canada is home to the fourth largest Korean diaspora after United States, China, and Japan. And also, we believe that the cooperation on the critical minerals will open a new chapter in the relationship between our two countries. If you see the history of our relationship, the energy cooperation has been always the engine for the growth of our bilateral relations. And Korean investment in Canada started in the 1970s with the investment in mining, like the traditional source of energy like coal, gas, and oil. And it was expanded into the sustainable and renewable energies like solar power and wind power. And also there was a milestone in the nuclear energy cooperation. Korea has imported the Canada can-do nuclear model in the 1970s, and we started the first operation of the can-do model in year 1983. So Korea has now grown to the home to the largest can-do model reactor outside of Canada. And now that cooperation is moving into the energy storage, the electric vehicle batteries. And as of now, 4 big projects are going on. One in Windsor, the Korean company called LG Energy Solution, in joint venture with Stellantis. They are now making huge investment to manufacture the electric vehicle batteries. And I heard that that is the largest investment in the Canadian auto history. And there are other 3 big projects on the way in Quebec. And this investment is quite different from the previous one because it's about manufacturing. And in case of the plant that will be open in Windsor, we are expecting it's going to create 2,500 jobs. So having these factories will have a spillover effect of more Korean companies will be coming to Canada, and also there will be more movements in goods and people between our two countries. And lastly, well, as you said, Korea is also very much committed to the zero economy, and like Canada, we are among the first countries to enact the law with the net zero economy by 2050. But we are facing so many challenges since Korea is not like, well, the Canada, so there are so much land constraints, so there is a clear limit to expand the renewable energy in Korea, and also in case of energy, there is a strong the reservation in the public side, so also there is a limit to expand our nuclear reactors. So we need like the partner, foreign partner like Canada, and we are also now participating in the LNG Canada, and the Korean company Kogas, we have a 5% well, the share in that project, and it's going to be completed in year 2025. And when we import the Canadian LNG from 2025, also it's going to contribute to the Korean government's effort to reduce greenhouse gas emission. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Cooperation is certainly really important in meeting our net zero targets, and that includes cooperation on scientific research, which has been central to the Arctic. Non-Arctic states have been very active, not just participating in conferences within the Arctic, but they've also organized events within their respective countries through the years on a range of topics. I remember I'm from Singapore originally, and whenever I used to visit Singapore every year to see the family, there would always be an Arctic conference or a seminar at least twice a year. They were very active, and it has continued through the pandemic as well. Ambassadors, do you want to note some of the upcoming Arctic events or other forms of cooperation to take place in Japan and Korea this coming year or next? Ambassador Yamanouchi?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm proud to tell you that next month, 2 meetings regarding the Arctic be held in Tokyo. The one is the Arctic Circle Japan Forum. This is the 3 days event, and we expect the Canadian participation. And actually, we do have the one special session with Canada. And Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada has been participating and sending a lot of experts. And on top of that, and in this session, one indigenous group from Nunavut will be participating for the special session for indigenous people and the Arctic. And likewise, in Japan, we do have the similar kind of indigenous people called Ainu. The representative of that Ainu people also will join. So they will talk about the indigenous people, how to maintain the tradition and cultures and the things in the Arctic side affected by this global warming. So that's, we are very proud of that, this Arctic Circle Japan Forum. And also, following days, and we will host the international seminar on Arctic region. This is the 7th round. Also, we're expecting the Canadian experts from the various universities, not University of Toronto, but McGill, or University of Saskatchewan, or University of New Brunswick, and others. And the Canadian participants will be expected to contribute to the discussion. And this is very much scientific one, because Arctic was sort of closed off by ice up to recently. So there are so many unknowns. So we have to be very humble that we don't know yet. So observation, far, sort of separated from the political things or geopolitics, just scientific research to understand what's going on there. It's so critical. And also the weather condition in Arctic area will affect the whole global sort of, weather and this abnormal weather. So I think this cooperation is so significant.
Thank you. Ambassador Lim?
Korea is sort of the latecomer in terms of the scientific research on the Arctic. We started to be involved in the scientific research on the Arctic in the 1990s. So we are almost 30 years behind other leading countries. And the Korean government is well aware that there is still a long way to go. But if you see our Korean government's official paper or official strategy, then the expanding our scientific and technological capacity is one of the our top agenda. And in the past, since Korea is the sixth largest trading nation, we are also very much interested in the new opportunity the ice melting is going to open up. But like our foreign ministry in the past, the bureau in charge of economic cooperation bureau was in charge of the Arctic. But now we shifted that responsibility to the bureau in charge of the climate change. So we want to contribute to the international effort on the climate change, especially in the Arctic. And during that research process, Korean researchers found that the extraordinary heat wave and cold wave in East Asia is partly caused by the ice melting in the Arctic. So having more research on the Arctic is not only our contribution to the international community, but also it is one of the ways to address climate change issue in the Korean Peninsula and also in East Asia. And we have a very limited capacity as of now. We have just one research institute in Norway, and we have one icebreaker research vessel, but that vessel is in charge of two poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic. So last year we started to build the next generation icebreaker, and when you have it, we are planning to locate that new next generation the icebreaker in the Arctic and sending this one to the Antarctic. Then we'd have more chance to make more contribution on the Arctic issue. And about our plan to organize the event on the Arctic, since 2016, we have organized the annual event called Arctic Partnership Week. We usually organize that event in the first week of December, and last year we had it in the Korean port city called Busan, and it was a 5-day session, and we are planning to have it again this year. So when all the details are decided, I'll be happy to share it with you as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Certainly looking forward to getting back to more events in Asia on the Arctic. Let me now turn to the room for questions from the floor, and maybe we could collect maybe 2 or 3, maybe brief questions, and then give our members of the panel a chance to reflect on some of those questions that they would like to answer, and that'll probably take us to the time to closing. Any questions? Yes.
Hello, Hamid Shirazi. I work with Innovation Norway in Canada. I was going to ask His Excellency, when you mentioned something about export diversification and that some Korean companies maybe overly relied on Chinese suppliers. So what happens when they look for new sources that could be significantly more expensive? So how Korea manage that difference? Because somebody has to pay for that difference. Is it that consumers ultimately, or government has incentives in Korea that can narrow the gap? Usually companies go to maybe China or some of the other countries for resources as a, it has attractive cost attached to it because of the labor and abundance of those resources. Some other countries might not have the similar situations. And I was wondering how Korea has managed to overcome that difference in cost pricing. Thank you.
Yes. Well, since the business community, they just follow the money. So in theory or in this round table, we can just say we can diversify the economic partners to the like-minded countries. But in reality, it's quite a different story from the business community. But When I met with the Korean business leaders, they are fully aware that this kind of business cannot continue. They need to diversify, and diversification has already started in the Korean economy. But in the past, we usually seek new partnership with the Southeast Asian countries. But now we are looking to the United States and Canada as a new partner. But as you said, there is issue of price competitiveness. But that decision is something that should be decided by the business community. The Korean government cannot force Samsung and LG to discontinue the contract with the Chinese and Vietnamese and have a new contract with the Canadian and the United States. But what government is supposed to do is to lay the groundwork, make the new platform for the Korean businessmen to have more information on the critical minerals in Canada or the feasibility studies. So now we are working on the MOU on critical minerals with the Canadian government. And with that MOU in place, then the Korean business community, they have a more, much clear idea about how they can diversify the source of the critical minerals. Thank you.
Ambassador Yamanouchi.
If I may make a comment. And I just mentioned the critical mineral and the other important element is a kind of intersection between market economy and green economy and geopolitics. So if world is very peace and price matters, so if we just follow the globalism and also market economy, low price is the best. But what if those low prices only because they don't care much about human rights of laborers, or they don't care much about the environmentally friendly process of producing the products? Then naturally, price goes up. Then what if we do have a certain international practice and international sort of rule to regulate that kind of the human rights of laborers and also environmental issues? So nowadays, we do have the free trade agreement. So free trade is very important. But at the same time, usually the free trade agreement, like a TPP, or a bunch of the free trade agreements, include the provisions of the human rights and the environmental issues. That is a kind of a solution. And on top of that, these geopolitical challenges. So Deputy Prime Minister Freeland mentioned friend shoring, because the dependency on those important elements should not be treated as a political purposes by the totalitarian countries. Therefore, I think that this diversification or like a shift of the major companies is going on. And the major companies, yes, they're very keen about the profit and calculating all the time. But the reputation risk is also a very important factor for the major companies in Korea or Japan, in the United States. So I think that is going on the business side.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
Thank you. Just to build on that, we talk about a shift. We include then sort of the participation and actual involvement of Indigenous peoples, particularly in the Canadian Arctic. When you talk about the issues from Japan about uncertainty in timelines and involvement of Indigenous peoples and the environmental regulatory system. From the Northwest Territories perspective, which is where we are, I think we're talking about the shift from the beginning of projects. So how do you take that concept of shift when you bring in the market economy, the green economy, and the geopolitical realities to now right down to the micro level where you're talking about the peoples whose land these critical minerals are on? And is it really about bringing that shift of discussion all the way to the very beginning of projects? So I'm not sure if that question makes sense, but.
Actually, I'll just really quick, because mine was is along these lines, and so maybe to consolidate, because I was going to ask, it's two-part, because I was going to ask if the pause on the Arctic Council, there was a lot of collaboration between the observer states and the permanent participants, and so there was collaboration with the observer states on research and other things with the indigenous permanent participants. And so I'm wondering if that's challenged now, or if you're able to still do the cooperation and research that way. And along those lines, and thinking in terms of a from a Canadian approach, is there more interest now in light of everything to find ways to have more, I don't know, maybe a mechanism or more engagement with indigenous communities in the north, because that is that's a big piece of the investment aspect when it comes to with mining.
Yeah. So if I understand the question correctly, but the thing is, I carefully read the critical mineral strategy issued last December. It clearly said that this critical mineral strategy has a significance on the business opportunity in Canada, developing the economy, good economy. The second, also, they have to have the good sort of the balance with the environmental issues, because we have to mitigate, and we have to adjust ourselves for this climate change, and we have to contribute that. And also, most of those critical mineral area is northern side and owned by the First Nation and indigenous people. So this development of this opportunity have to be in line with their understanding and support, and also their economic development, and their opportunities for jobs, education, and things like that. It's all combined. Then the reason why this critical mineral strategy was issued last December is based upon today's reality of geopolitics. So then now a Canadian government and also Canadian people realize we have to find the right balance between, of course, if price is too much, no one buy it. But at the same time, Canada can contribute a lot. Canada can help the world. So now I think all the Canadian governments and the Canadian companies and people are seeking that right balance. I do think necessity is the mother of success all the time. So given these geopolitical challenges of the 21st century, I think Canadian people and also like-minded countries like South Korea, Japan, the United States will work together to find the right balance to save the world. That's what I think.
Whenever the issue of the indigenous people, the cooperation with the indigenous people comes up, I'm telling my colleagues the African proverb, where if you want to go fast, then go alone, but if you want to go far, then go together. So we really respect the Canadian government's policy and attitude toward indigenous people, even though sometimes the Korean businessmen they are expressing sort of the frustration because of the delay in the process, but nobody will complain about the need for cooperation with the indigenous community. But sometimes for them, the time is of the essence for the business community. So they just want to expedite the process, not bypass or skip the process. And for my government and our embassy, this is the engagement with the indigenous people. It's not just a business issue, it's an issue of the cultural exchange and people-to-people exchange. And we invite 4 indigenous people to Korean universities. We are giving the scholarship for the master's course, and we are planning to invite 36 indigenous people to the master's program to study navigation and science and technology. And since Korea became the observer in the North Arctic Council, our embassy had organized an annual event to engage with the indigenous people. And last time, a group of embassy people, they went to Northwest Territory and having the sort of the Korea Week, and I heard a very amazing story. The director that led that our embassy team, she told me that when they met the indigenous people, most of them have never left their neighborhood, their town, and they don't know much about Korea. Even most of them haven't heard about Korea. But since we have engaged with them for several days, they start to ask a question about Korea, like, why is Korea divided? Also, why BTS member should go to the military? So that kind of enhancement of mutual understanding is a really critical part of our relationship between Korea and Canada. And this is sort of my personal story. I presented my credentials, the letter of credence, last November. And that ceremony was held in the Quebec City. And it was quite surprised. Why do I need to present my credential not in Ottawa, but in the Quebec City? And the chief of protocol in the foreign ministry, he explained that they are usually organizing the ceremony for presentation of the credential 4 to 5 times a day. And they have a decades-long tradition of organizing at least one event in the Quebec City. Your Governor General, she has 2 residents, one in Ottawa and the other one in the Quebec City, and to show the unity between the French-speaking and English-speaking communities, the Canada will maintain that tradition of having one ceremony in the Quebec City. So I presented my credential in the Quebec City to the Governor General from the indigenous people. And I believe this is what Canada stands for. This is the real strength of Canada. And when we heard about that program, there were some critical voice. Since there is no direct flight between Ottawa and the Quebec City, and when we travel to the city, then the families and the embassy people, so many people should be moving to the Quebec City. So it doesn't make sense economically, but that's what Canada stands for. And I'm strong believer of your government's effort to engage indigenous people and high environmental standard. Sometimes it takes time, but in the long term, that's the right way to go.
Yeah. Thank you. Engagement goes both ways, right? And just like say, BTS's popularity permeates throughout the globe, clearly. Do we have any other questions or comments? Yes.
Just one little anecdote about the communication with the indigenous people. So you talked about LNG Canada. It is a project in the biggest private investment project in the history of Canada, and it's going on in the British Columbia. Then Mitsubishi Corporation is involved with that. In order to get the support and the understanding of the indigenous people, they have conducted 12,000 meetings with each of them. 12,000, not 1,200, 12,000. The closely communication, and that paved the way. And also when the Minister Wilkinson launched the Sustainable Critical Mineral Alliance in Montreal, in ceremony, the bunch of the leaders of First Nations came. They are very much interested in that. So I think that is a great sort of a step forward to communicate each other regarding this economic development and their welfare, their opportunities of education, job. And I think we will find the great way. Right. And I really I'm impressed that the Korean government invite those indigenous people, and they know the BTS. That's great. I'm impressed. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.